Let's look at a few notes regarding the Unleashed to Xero integration. Once you have completed the setup between Unleashed and Xero, real-time data will be passed between these two systems. Part of the setup requires you to select which Xero accounts you would like to link to Unleashed. This includes linking the relevant sales account, cost of goods sold account, and stock on hand account. After the integration, Unleashed will only send completed transactions to Xero. Those transactions will then appear as drafts in Xero. Let's look at a few scenarios regarding purchasing. A completed purchase order in Unleashed will send a draft payable to Xero. So looking at Unleashed, where we have purchase order 09, we can see that it is completed. Please note that the order date is the date that will be sent to Xero. The payment terms will be used to calculate the due date in Xero. When we look at the payable that was passed to Xero, we can see the order date, the due date, and there is also a reference to purchase order 09 in Unleashed. The next scenario is for a completed purchase order, which includes costs for the same supplier as whom you purchased the products from. This will send a draft payable to Xero. So looking at purchase order 11 in Unleashed, we can see that we have Trisha's Trinkets as the supplier for the product line as well as the cost line. So then looking at the payable in Xero, we can see that there is a payable for Trisha's Trinkets for the product as well as the cost. Our next scenario is for a completed purchase order, which includes costs from a different supplier to whom you purchased the products from. This will send a draft payable for supplier 1 and a draft payable for supplier 2 to Xero. So here we can see that we have Depot Dadello as the supplier for the product line and Berry Boutique as the supplier for the cost line on purchase order 18. So when we look at Xero, we can see that there is a payable for Depot Dadello as well as a payable for Berry Boutique for the cost. A completed supplier return in Unleashed will send a draft credit note for the supplier to Xero. So here we can see that we have Supplier Return 02 for Ranwell Megastore in Unleashed. When we look at Xero, we will see the credit note related to the supplier return for Ranwell Megastore. A completed supplier return in Unleashed that includes costing for the same supplier as whom you purchased the products from will send a draft credit note for the supplier to Xero. So here we have Supplier Return 12 for Ranwell Megastore, which includes costs for Ranwell Megastore 2. Also note that we have opted to refund the costs instead of writing them off. So when we look at Xero, we will see the credit note for Ranwell Megastore for that supplier return. A completed supplier return in Unleashed that includes costing for a different supplier from whom you purchased the products from will send a draft credit note for supplier 1 and a draft credit note for supplier 2. So looking at supplier return 13 in Unleashed, we can see that we are returning goods for Trisha's Trinkets and refunding costs for Depot Dadello. Looking at Xero, you will see a credit note for the goods we are returning to Trisha's Trinkets, as well as a credit note for the costs that are being refunded to Depot Dadello. Let's have a look at a few scenarios for inventory. A completed stock adjustment in Unleashed will send a draft journal to Xero. So here we can see we have stock adjustment 04 in Unleashed. Please note that the value will need to be either positive or negative to send a journal. If the value is 0, then no journal will be sent. Let's then look at Xero, and here you can see we have a journal for stock adjustment 04. A completed stock take in Unleashed will also send a draft journal to Xero. So here we have stock take 04 in Unleashed, and again, similarly with stock adjustments, please note that the value will need to be positive or negative to send a journal. If the value is 0, then no journal will be sent. Once it is sent to Xero, we can now see that we have a journal for stock take 04. Let's look at a few scenarios for sales. A completed invoice in Unleashed will send a draft receivable to Xero. So here we have sales invoice 137 in Unleashed. Please note that the invoice date will be sent to Xero. The payment terms will be used to calculate the due date. So when that is passed to Xero, we will have the receivable for sales invoice 137, including the date and the due date, which was pulled through from Unleashed. A completed shipment in Unleashed will send a draft journal to Xero. So looking at shipment 137 in Unleashed, we can see that the dispatch date is the 20th of October, which will be sent to Xero. Let's now look at Xero, and here you can see the journal for that shipment, and you can also see that that dispatch date of the 20th of October has been sent through. A credit in Unleashed that does not include goods being returned will send a draft credit note for the customer to Xero. So here we have credit note 04 in Unleashed for Ben's Supplies, and we can see that we have not selected the return checkbox. When we look at the transaction in Xero, we can see the credit note for Ben's Supplies. If you are returning goods as part of the credit in Unleashed, a draft credit note as well as a draft journal will be sent to Xero. So here we have credit note 05 in Unleashed for Frank & Co. And we can see that we have selected the return checkbox. When we look at the transaction in Xero, we can see the credit note for Frank & Co. as well as a journal for them. Here are a few scenarios for customers. A new customer created in Unleashed will send a customer contact to Xero. So here I have created customer ABC in Unleashed. When we look at Xero, we will be able to see customer ABC under contacts. Please note also that there is a limit of 5 contacts for each customer. Here are a few scenarios for suppliers. A new supplier created in Unleashed will send a supplier contact to Xero. So here I have created supplier XYZ in Unleashed, and when we look at Xero, we will find supplier XYZ under contacts. For more information regarding the Xero integration, remember to check the help files on the Unleashed website.